"Remember me, cowboy," said the Apache girl that the white man once fell in love with. The desert light was dying, spilling golden blood across the San Pedro Valley. Calder Boone pulled Dustfoot to a halt at the river's edge, where the cottonwoods cast long, trembling shadows over the water. The air smelled of heat and iron, the kind that carried old memories. He hadn't ridden this trail since boyhood, not since the night the Apaches were driven from these banks. Yet the firelight ahead drew him closer. Across the river, a small camp flickered alive, figures moving slow against the dusk. One of them stepped forward, a woman. Her posture was proud, her hair long and dark as midnight water. The fire caught her eyes, and something inside Calder tightened, as if the years between them had vanished. She looked straight at him, voice soft but cutting through the wind. "Remember me, cowboy." The world went still as the river carried the sound into the fading sun. The San Pedro Valley lay open beneath the burning sky, a stretch of earth the color of rust and bone. Wind carried the scent of mesquite and dry grass, sweeping through fences long splintered by time. Here, the world moved slow, measured by cattle bells, sunrises, and the creak of wooden gates. Calder Boone had spent nearly all his 28 years on this land. From dawn until dark, he worked the Boone Ranch, fixing fences, breaking horses, driving herds across the low hills where the river shimmered like silver thread. His father, Richard Boone, had built the place with iron in his spine and walls in his heart. He believed in two things: the sweat of a man's back and the danger of trusting anyone who wasn't white. Calder had learned most of his lessons from silence. He moved through each day with the steady calm of someone who'd accepted solitude as part of his nature. Yet there was always something restless behind his eyes, like the current beneath still water. On his hat hung a small gray stone tied by a faded red thread. It had been there for years, worn smooth by sun and wind. No one in town asked about it anymore, and Calder never explained. That stone was the last remnant of another life, one that began beside this very river, when he was a boy chasing a wild filly and fell headfirst into the shallows. He remembered the sound of laughter, light and musical, and a girl kneeling by the water. Her name had been Tahala, a child of the Apache band that once camped near the valley. She'd laughed not out of mockery, but with warmth so bright it lingered in his bones. For one summer, they'd been inseparable, two children ignoring the world's borders, until one night the riders came, and the fires along the river burned everything that was left of innocence. Years passed. The town grew cautious, fenced, and forgetful. Men built barns where the old Apache camps had stood. Calder became the kind of man his father respected: hardworking, wordless, predictable. Yet every now and then, as he rode the range, he'd hear an echo in the wind, laughter, soft as a ghost. Now, as the sun sank low behind the Galiuro Mountains, that echo had returned in the flesh. The woman across the river had the same eyes, steady and full of the desert's quiet strength. Her hair caught the firelight. Her movements carried the ease of someone who belonged to the land. Not the other way around. She was no longer the girl he'd known. Yet something about the set of her shoulders and the calm curve of her lips pulled him backward in time. Calder felt the ache of memory and the weight of his father's warnings collide inside him. Behind him, the valley waited his ranch, his duties, the men who would call him a fool if they saw him here. Ahead of him stood a woman whose very presence might shatter the peace he'd spent a decade building. But as the night deepened and the campfire's glow brushed gold over her face, he found himself leaning forward in the saddle. Maybe the past hadn't finished with him after all. Calder dismounted slowly, boots sinking into the damp sand. The river glimmered between them, narrow but heavy with memory. Across the water, Tehela stood unmoving, one hand resting lightly on a wooden bucket, the other tracing the braid that fell over her shoulder. "It's been a long time," Calder said. His voice came out rougher than he meant it to. Her eyes softened for a moment, then turned guarded. "Time has a way of burning things down, Cowboy. Even rivers change their course." He nodded, glancing at the sky as if searching for the years that had slipped away. "You're still here," he said quietly. "That's something." "I came back," she replied. "The land remembers us, even when people don't." Her words carried no bitterness, only truth, as steady as the current at her feet. For a while, neither spoke. The only sound was the whisper of water brushing over stones. Calder noticed the small details, first the scar along her wrist, the wear of travel on her clothes, the faint shimmer of ash on her skin from the campfire. She wasn't the child he'd known. There was resolve in her stillness, strength in her silence. "You shouldn't be here," he said finally. "This valley, it's not what it was. Folks get nervous easy. They talk." Tehela tilted her head, watching him as though he were a stranger pretending to be kind. "And what do they say about you?" Calder Boone. "The man who still wears an Apache charm on his hat." The words struck deep. His hand rose instinctively toward the small stone hanging from the red thread. For the first time in years, he considered taking it off, but he didn't. "They say enough," he answered, "but I don't much care." She studied him a moment longer, her expression unreadable. "You care more than you think," she said softly. "You just hide it better." Wind stirred the river's surface, scattering faint reflections of firelight. Calder found himself caught between what he wanted to say and what he feared she might hear. The gulf between them wasn't just water, it was time and loss, and everything the world had taught them about who they were supposed to be. "Why did you come back?" he asked. Her gaze drifted toward the horizon. "Because my people needed water. Because this valley once kept us alive." She paused, her tone quiet but firm. "And because I needed to see if the boy by the river ever kept his promise." Calder felt the breath leave him. "You mean the stone. I mean the heart behind it," she said. The air tightened between them. Somewhere downriver, a coyote called, its cry bending through the heat. Calder wanted to step closer, to tell her he'd thought of her in every summer wind that carried the scent of rain. But the words refused to form. He turned toward Dustfoot, gripping the reins. "There's talk in town," he murmured. "People saying your camp's too close to the ranches. Be careful. Tehela. They'll come looking for reasons." Her eyes followed him as he mounted. "Then let them look," she said. "Truth doesn't fear eyes, it fears silence." Calder met her gaze one last time before the shadows swallowed the space between them. He rode back toward the valley. But the echo of her voice followed him all the way home, steady, unyielding, and alive like the river that refused to die. The days that followed bled into one another, hot and slow, the kind of days when the air itself seemed to hum. Calder worked his herds as usual, but his thoughts stayed by the river. Every time the wind shifted from the south and carried the smell of mesquite smoke, he saw her Tehela, standing in the firelight with that calm that never asked, never begged, only waited. He told himself he wouldn't go back. And then, one evening, he did. She was tending a small garden by the water. Her sleeves rolled up, hands buried in the soil. The camp behind her was quiet, just a few lean horses, a child sleeping under a woven blanket, a man sharpening tools in the distance. Tehela looked up when Calder dismounted. "You came," she said simply. He gave a small nod, unsure whether to apologize or explain. "Brought some cornmeal," he said instead, setting a small sack by the stones. "And salt. Figure it might help." Tehela wiped her hands on her skirt. "Kindness makes folks in town uneasy," she said, a flicker of amusement crossing her lips. "They already think I'm uneasy," Calder replied, "so I might as well earn it." She smiled faintly, and something in the air shifted, less guarded, more human. They sat by the water that evening, neither in a rush to speak. Tehela showed him how she used dried leaves to make medicine for fevers. Calder listened, watching the way she handled each plant with respect, as if the valley itself were a living thing that needed gentleness. When he asked how she'd learned so much, her expression turned distant. "My mother," she said. "She used to say, the earth never stops talking. We just forget how to listen." Calder stared at the water, hearing the low gurgle against the rocks. "Guess I've forgotten most things worth knowing. Not all," she said, eyes drifting to the red thread on his hat. He looked down, fingers brushing the stone. "I kept it," he admitted. "Didn't know why for a long time. Maybe I do now." "And what's that?" He met her gaze. "Because it reminded me of something honest, something I didn't have to explain." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was warm, like the hush after rain. Over the next week, Calder visited again and again. Sometimes he brought supplies, sometimes only company. He helped repair a fence near her camp, fetched water from the deeper bends of the river, even taught one of the younger men how to mend a bridle. The trust between them grew in quiet gestures, shared labor, shared glances, the comfort of being seen without words. But the valley had ears. One afternoon, while Calder was loading hay in town, he heard a voice behind him drawl, "Boone's gone soft for that Apache woman." The laughter that followed was sharp, cutting through the still air. He turned to see Hank Crow leaning against a post, smirking. Beside him stood Silas Dunn, the merchant whose hands were always too clean for ranch work. "Careful who you talk to." "Crow," Calder said evenly. Crow's smile widened. "Careful's for men who got something to lose. You've already thrown in your lot with the wrong kind." Before Calder could answer, Dunn cut in, voice smooth as oil. "No need for trouble. Gentlemen, but maybe you should mind the company you keep. Boone. Folks in town don't like what they can't control." That night, Calder rode back to the river earlier than usual. He found Tehela waiting by the cottonwoods, moonlight silvering her hair. "They've started talking," he said quietly. "Men like Crow and Dunn. I expected they would." She didn't flinch. "Truth threatens those who build their power on fear. They'll come for you," he warned. "Maybe not tonight, but soon." Tehela looked at him, calm as always. "Then we stand before they strike. We don't run again." Calder studied her face, the steadiness there, the fire under her skin. He realized then what frightened the town wasn't her people or her past, but her certainty. She wasn't asking to belong. She was reminding the world she already did. He exhaled. "Then we'll be ready." Tehela stepped closer, eyes reflecting the starlight. She reached up, fingers brushing the brim of his hat, the thread, the stone. "When we were children," she said softly, "I tied this so you wouldn't forget me. But maybe I should tie another, so you remember who you are." Calder lowered his head slightly. "Do it," he murmured. She pulled a fresh strand of red fiber from her pouch, looping it around the old thread with a steady hand. When she finished, the two pieces of color, old and new, twined together, glowing faintly in the firelight. "Now," she said, smiling faintly, "it's strong enough for two." Calder felt something settle in his chest, neither peace nor certainty, but the courage that comes from knowing what you'll fight for when the time comes. And the time, he knew, was coming soon. The storm began without thunder, just a heaviness in the air that made the horses restless and the birds silent. By late afternoon, the valley was smothered in the kind of heat that warned of trouble. Calder sensed it before he saw it. He was in town, tying Dustfoot outside the feed store, when he heard two voices from behind the grain barrels. Hank Crow and Jed Pruitt were talking low, but the wind carried enough. "After dark," Crow was saying, "we spill the blood by the creek. Leave the tracks leading straight to their camp. Dunn'll handle the rest. Get the sheriff. Stir the crowd. Make it look clean." Calder froze. His stomach clenched as the meaning hit him. They were planning to stage a theft, maybe worse, to frame the Apache camp. A reason to drive them out, or worse, start another fire. He didn't move until Crow spat and walked off. Pruitt followed, laughing nervously. Calder waited for the sound of their boots to fade before stepping out. He knew what had to be done. That night, he rode hard for the river. The air was thick and metallic, clouds building like bruises over the mountains. When he reached the cottonwoods, Tahala was waiting by the fire, as if she'd known he would come. "They mean to start something," he said, breathless. "Crow, Dunn, Pruitt, they'll fake a raid tonight, use blood from a slaughtered steer, say your people did it." Her eyes darkened, though her voice stayed steady. "They'll do it soon. Then blame us by morning." "Exactly." He knelt, drawing in the sand with a stick. "They'll come from the ridge. We can't stop them from trying, but we can catch them in it. If we're careful, we can make them their own witnesses." Tahala nodded once. "Then we'll let the river tell the truth." They moved quickly. Calder took two of her men silent, sure-footed, and led them through the brush along the ridge path. They waited among the mesquite while Tahala stayed near the camp, setting a few faint fires to keep her people visible. Harmless, occupied. Hours crawled by. Crickets screamed, then fell silent as hoofbeats approached. Crow came first, leading Pruitt and a third man with a cart. They unloaded a carcass. A steer bled half dry. Crow knelt beside it, scooping blood into a tin pail. "Spread it near their fire," he ordered. "We'll make it look like a raid. Dunn'll swear he saw him riding off." Calder's pulse hammered. He could almost taste the dust. Then the plan turned. The moment Crow raised his arm to spill the blood, Calder stepped out of the shadows. "That'll be enough." Crow spun, hand flying to his pistol. Calder didn't flinch. "Put it down." "Hank! You!" Crow's voice cracked like a whip. "You side with them savages now." Before Calder could speak, Tahala appeared from the dark behind him, her silhouette sharp against the faint firelight. "Savage," she said evenly. "You kill beasts just to lie. Tell me, which of us is that?" The tension snapped. Crow fired first. The shot tore through the quiet, grazing Calder's shoulder. He stumbled but stayed on his feet, returning fire not to kill, but to scare. The blast sent Crow reeling backward into the shallows. Pruitt dropped his gun and bolted, but one of Tahala's men blocked his path. Dunn arrived moments later on horseback, lantern swinging wildly. "What in God's name?" he began. but froze when Tehela held up a stained piece of paper she'd plucked from Crow's vest pocket, a contract bearing Dunn's signature, promising water rights and profit in exchange for removal of hostile encampments. Calder's voice came out like gravel. Seems the only thing stolen here is decency. For a second, the only sound was the rush of the river. Then Dunn turned his horse and fled toward town. Tehela stepped to Calder, pressing a hand against his bleeding shoulder. "You're hurt. Just grazed," he muttered. "We've got bigger wounds to show." They bound Crow and Pruitt with rope and kept the evidence, the blood-stained pail, the forged agreement, before dawn. They sent a rider to fetch Deputy Amos Heller, one of the few lawmen in town with a conscience. By sunrise, the deputy arrived, weary-eyed but alert. He took one look at the scene, the false trail, the papers, the cow carcass, and nodded grimly. "I'll call a meeting," he said, "before Dunn spins another story." Calder looked at Tehela. Her expression was unreadable, but the faintest tremor passed through her fingers. "You sure about this?" she asked. "Once we stand before them, there's no going back." He gave a tired smile. "I've been going back all my life. Maybe it's time to go forward." She held his gaze, and in that moment, the tension between fear and faith broke. Whatever happened in town, they would face it together, not as a cowboy and an Apache, but as two people who refused to let lies rule the land that raised them. The sun broke over the mountains, red as fire on steel. The river, dark and endless, carried their reflections side by side, and for the first time, Calder Boone didn't feel like the valley's silence was something to hide behind. It was something to answer. The town hall of San Pedro was a long, low building with walls the color of old bone. By mid-morning, every seat was filled. The air was heavy with dust and suspicion. Men fanned their collars, whispering to one another. Women sat stiffly, eyes sharp as needles. At the front of the room stood Deputy Amos Heller, hat tucked under his arm, gaze grave. Behind him, the sun filtered through warped window panes, cutting across the crowd in streaks of white light, to one side. Silas Dunn smoothed his vest, the picture of calm deceit, and beside him, Hank Crow, his arm in a sling, glared with the sullen defiance of a man cornered. When the door creaked open, all conversation ceased. Calder Boone stepped inside, his left sleeve torn and stained with dried blood. Behind him came Tehela, walking tall, her presence quiet but undeniable. The crowd murmured. Someone hissed, "She's got no right here." Another whispered, "That's the Apache woman." Calder ignored them. He set a bundle on the table before the deputy papers, a tin pail still crusted with blood, and a small coil of rope. "This," he said evenly, "is the truth you've all been chasing." Dunn rose to his feet, face reddening. "This is an outrage. You expect us to believe the word of them." He gestured sharply toward Tehela. Amos Heller's voice cut clean through the noise. "Mr. Boone, tell the room what you saw." Calder spoke slowly, the way a man does when each word carries weight. He told them about Crow's plan to fake a raid, about Dunn's signature promising profit, about the blood spilled not by Apache hands, but by men hungry for land. As he spoke, the room shifted, murmurs turning into uneasy silence. Dunn tried to interrupt. "Lies. He's protecting her." Everyone knows Boone's. Calder slammed his palm against the table, hard enough to rattle the lanterns. "You want to call me a liar? Silas, do it looking me in the eye." Dunn hesitated. Tehela stepped forward then, her voice calm but carrying like a bell. "You call us thieves, but it's your fear that steals the truth." My people came here for water. We took nothing else. The river doesn't lie. It carries every sin downstream. Someone in the back muttered. Let her talk. She continued, her tone softer now. We've run long enough from shadows you made, but not today. The deputy turned to Crow. Mr. Crow, you want to say something? Crow's jaw worked. Sweat glistened on his temple. We were only doing what Dunn said. He said it'd be easy, that nobody'd get hurt. A gasp rippled through the room. Dunn's face drained of color. You fool, he barked, lunging toward Crow. But two men grabbed his arms before he could reach him. Amos raised his hand. That's enough. Mr. Dunn, you're under arrest for conspiracy and attempted fraud. Dunn sputtered, shouting about lies and loyalty. But the deputy's voice drowned him out. You'll have your say in Tucson. But this valley's had enough poison for one lifetime. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Clara Mayfield, a gray-haired widow from the North Ranch, rose slowly from her seat. That woman, she said, pointing toward Tahala, brought me medicine when my boy had fever. Never asked for pay. Never asked for trust. Just helped. She turned to the crowd. If kindness is a crime, then I reckon I'm guilty too. The silence broke, not with applause, but with the sound of shifting boots, uncertainty giving way to thought. A few heads nodded. One man said quietly, She saved my cattle last winter, warned us about the river rising. Amos looked around. Seems this valley remembers more than it admits. Calder glanced toward his father, Richard Boone, sitting in the second row, face carved in stone. For years, the man's approval had been a locked door. Now, Richard met his son's eyes, and for the first time, there was no anger there, only the weary recognition of a truth he could no longer fight. He gave a single nod. The deputy gestured toward the doorway. Miss Tahala, Mr. Boone, if you'll wait outside, I'll settle the paperwork. Outside. The sunlight hit them like a wave. The crowd spilled out behind, quiet but not hostile. Some wouldn't meet their eyes. Others offered short nods of acknowledgement. It wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't hatred either. It was the first crack in the wall. Calder breathed deeply, the air tasting cleaner than he remembered. You did it, he said. You made them listen. Tahala shook her head, eyes on the river beyond the rooftops. No, the truth did. We just spoke its name down the street. Dunn was being led toward the jailhouse. Crow limped beside him, muttering prayers. The valley had shifted just a little, but enough to matter. Calder turned to Tahala. They'll still talk. Some will hate us for it. She looked up at him, the faintest smile touching her lips. Let them. Change never asks permission. He laughed softly, surprised by the sound of it. Guess it doesn't. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of river mud and cottonwood. Somewhere behind them, the deputy's voice barked orders, but neither turned back. For the first time in a long while, Calder felt the valley breathing again slow, uncertain, but alive, Doug. And as they walked toward the water's edge together, the sunlight caught the red thread on his hat, making it burn like a single spark in the wood. Forgiving sky. Autumn settled gently over San Pedro Valley, softening the edges of summer's scars. The river ran slower now, its waters cool and clear, winding between stands of cottonwood that had begun to turn yellow. On the ridge above, the Boone Ranch still stood, but something about it had changed, less fortress, more home. Calder spent his mornings in the same rhythm as before, mending fences, checking wells, riding out with Dustfoot through the pasture. Yet the silence felt different now, not the kind that pressed down, but the kind that listened. Every evening, when the sun dipped low, he found himself drawn back to the river. There, near the curve where the bank widened, a small patch of earth had been turned into something new, a garden. Rows of sage and wild mint grew beside pots of desert flowers. The scent of dried herbs lingered in the air, mingling with smoke from a small fire. Tehela knelt nearby, her hair catching the late light like spun bronze. He dismounted, the saddle creaking softly. "You've made this place alive again," he said. She smiled without looking up. It was never dead, just waiting to be remembered. He crouched beside her, watching her fingers press seeds into the soil. Around them, the faint murmur of the town reached through the trees, the clatter of wagons, the distant laughter of children. Not everyone had accepted their presence. Some crossed the street rather than speak to Calder now. Others still muttered about the Apache witch by the river. But more and more people came quietly, farmers seeking medicine for fever, mothers bringing their children for herbs, ranch hands trading salt for healing balm. Change, like water, found its way through stone one afternoon. Clara Mayfield arrived with a basket of apples, her hands trembling slightly. "These came from my trees," she told Tehela, "best I ever grew." It was a small gesture, but Calder saw the weight it carried. The woman who'd once feared her now offered something of her own harvest. When Clara left, Tehela turned to Calder, her voice barely above the rustle of leaves. "Do you see it? The river's teaching them again?" He nodded. Slow work, but honest. As dusk fell, they sat side by side on the smooth stones by the water. The sky above flared orange, fading into violet. Calder took off his hat, holding it in his lap. The small gray stone and red threads swung lightly from the brim. "You know," he said, "I kept this because it reminded me of who I wanted to be. Not the rancher my father raised, but the boy you taught to see the world with both eyes open." Tehela reached into her satchel and drew out another stone smaller, paler, shaped like a heart. She tied it carefully beside the old one. "Then let this one remind you that change takes two." He watched her fingers work, her movement sure and gentle. When she finished, the two stones hung together, clinking softly as the breeze passed. They stayed there long after the sun slipped away, the fire beside them burning low. The night came alive with the chirr of crickets and the soft roll of the river. Calder leaned back on his palms, gazing at the stars. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked. Tehela shook her head. "This valley has enough ghosts. It doesn't need two more wandering." He smiled at that. "Then we stay." She turned toward him, eyes reflecting the faint glow of the embers. "Staying isn't what matters," she said softly. "Building is, behind them." Faint laughter drifted from the town, a sound so ordinary, so human, that it almost made Calder laugh. Too. Maybe this was what peace sounded like, not triumph, but the slow breathing of a place learning to forgive itself. He reached for her hand, and she let him. Together, they watched the river slide past dark, endless, alive in its surface. The reflection of the red thread shimmered like a line of fire across the water, twisting gently but never breaking. Somewhere down the valley, a child called out. A dog barked. The stars blinked awake, one by one. Calder lifted his hat again, touching the twin stones. "Funny," he murmured, "how something so small can carry so much." Tehela smiled. "So does love, if you let it." The river answered with its quiet song, winding through the valley that had once divided them, now binding them together. And from that evening on, Folks in San Pedro began to call the curve of the river by a new name, Promise Bend, for the cowboy, and the woman who taught it how to remember. Some rivers never forget the names whispered on their banks. If this story of Calder Boone and Tahala touched your heart, take a moment to let us know. Tell us where you're watching from, or share this story with someone who still believes love can change even the hardest ground. Every day, we bring you tales of the Wild West, stories of courage, redemption, and hearts that refuse to surrender. Subscribe, stay with us by the fire, and remember, even out here, beneath the endless western sky, love still finds its way home.